Thank you. I've studied Franciscan anti-Semitism of the 15th century, and they say exactly the same things, but they also quote canon law. By this period, were all the anti-Semitic tenets of canon law out? Do you know? I know there was a major new revision code that came out earlier in the century.
Right. I mean, the revision of the canon code actually had been spearheaded by Pietro Gasparri, who was the Secretary of State of Pius XI in his first 8 years in papacy. But no, I mean, for example, I don't know what, all the aspects of canon law you mentioned, but certainly some of the traditional anti-Semitic aspects of liturgy, for example, are still there. In fact, what got folks at the Holy Office of the Inquisition so most concerned at the Friends of Israel, why it needed to be dissolved, was they were calling for ending the use in the Easter liturgy of the perfidious Jews and so forth.
So, and I wasn't clear. It wasn't clear to me in his intended February 11th speech. Did the Pope actually denounce Mussolini, or we have to wait for your book to find out?
No, actually, it's somebody else has published that text. Emma Fattorini, who's a historian of the church at Sapienza, University of Rome, recently published it. It's a bit of it was like, if any of you read the book, The Hidden Encyclical, about the encyclical that the Pope commissioned to denounce anti-Semitism and racism. If you then read the text of what apparently was on the Pope's desk, it's a bit of a disappointment because it contains a lot of what we would today regard as anti-Semitic stereotypes as well. In the case of the speech, it's not a dramatic denunciation. On the other hand, he talks about the fascist spies. He tells the bishops, do not talk on the telephone because the fascist spies will record it. And but it's not a wholesale denunciation. And he makes a negative remark about Nazi pagan ideology. So it's a speech that he would have found uncomfortable, but not the fully denunciatory speech that Mussolini was worried about.
If memory serves me right, Pacelli, when he was Secretary of State under Pius XI, negotiated the agreement accepting Hitler and also, of course, the Lateran Pact. What in your research have you learned about the tension between those two, or the agreement between those two in course of developing those two agreements?
Well, the Lateran Pacts are signed initially on February 11, 1929. This is before Pacelli is called back from Berlin, where he's the nuncio, the papal nuncio to Germany. And so he was not, although I have read various things where they make reference to his role in the negotiating the Lateran Pacts, he was not involved in negotiating the Lateran Pacts. On the other hand, he was the crucial negotiator with the representatives of the Nazi government within weeks, really, of it coming to power. So this is signed initially, I believe, in July of 1933, just months after he comes to power, one of the first international agreements made by the Nazi regime. A lot's been written about this. As you know, it is very controversial. There was the John Cornwell book about Hitler's Pope and so forth. Pacelli, at least in my view, he's certainly not Hitler's Pope, but he was someone whose interest was always in protecting the institutional church as he saw it. So he's worried about the church in Germany and what would happen. For example, when Hitler came to power in the region around Munich in Bavaria, 2/3 of school children were going to Catholic parochial schools. By the late 30s, something like 2% were. So for the Pope and also Pacelli, there was a lot to be concerned about, even aside from ideology per se, in terms of the influence of the church in Germany. So I think Pacelli thought what he was doing was protecting the institutional church. I don't think in my own reading, that a larger kind of ethical, moral obligation of this office, much less the office of Pope, was what weighed most heavily on him.
I'm wondering if you found evidence in your work of other responses from Catholic organizations, political organizations, people who were more at the ground level, and in terms of their knowledge and response to these laws, and also the compliance, if there was any evidence of compliance or not compliance with the anti-Semitic laws.
Yes, well, of course, 99% of Italians are at least nominally Catholic, so there's not much difference between Italians' reaction and Catholics, if we're using it in that sense, reaction to the racial laws. Here, one of the interesting documents we have available are in the fascist archives, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the police archives, because they had spies throughout Italy, and they'd be sending these reports. So when the racial laws are announced, you have reports about how people are reacting. And what's interesting is in some of the cities which have significant Jewish populations, there is evidence of people not being that happy. It also tied into some of their notion of the corruption of the fascist state, because what they saw were various fascist bigwigs, let's say in Turin, buying up at 5% of their value factories of Jewish factory owners and this kind of thing. And this attracted a lot of negative attention. On the other hand, a lot's been written recently in Italy about how the university professors reacted to the fact that all their Jewish colleagues were fired overnight. And the fact is there was virtually no protest at all. They eagerly took up their positions and in fact refused to give them up after the war to the people whose positions they had stolen, basically. So it's not a very pretty story. I'd say the Jews, there were major parts of Italy that had virtually no Jews in them. Virtually all, the Jews have been kicked out of the Kingdom of Naples, which was under Spanish influence back around 1500. And so, south of Rome, there were almost no Jews at all. So many Italians had grown up without ever, seeing a Jew or meeting a Jew. So for them, it really wasn't an issue. I suspect that those who did attend church, though, heard the demonization of the Jews, because the kind of language I was quoting from Civiltà Cattolica when I was reading diocesan bulletins, and as I mentioned, bulletins or magazines of Catholic Action Youth and so on, they were repeating the same language. So it's hard for me to believe. And similarly, there's L'Amico del Clero, a publication for the 20,000 priests in Italy, which was written at their level, was filled with this kind of anti-Semitic demonization. So I've got to believe they use some of this in their sermons and so forth. So for many Italians, they didn't know Jews. It was all kind of an abstraction. What little they knew, perhaps they learned from the church, was to perhaps lead them to believe this wasn't such a bad thing.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether you could speculate in a kind of comparative mode about the response that you've so excellently outlined today of the Vatican to all this, compared to the Deutsche Christen and the general Protestant anti-Semitism and collaborations with Nazism in the German world. I mean, that takes you beyond the purview of your lecture, but I wonder what would it have, especially on that question of race versus religious prejudice and the interaction and interfusion of the two, is that as likely to be found among those Protestants in the German world as among the Italians in the Catholic world?
Well, one of the things that I found is that the whole distinction between, race and religion is largely post-World War II. I mean, if you read the documents from this period, as you may have heard even in some of the quotes I used, you talk about the Jews as a race, as a religion, interchangeably. So I think if you talk about most people, now there are certain kind of academics who might debate the distinction, but for most people, I think they use the term interchangeably. And so there are other people here much more expert in Nazi Germany than I am. It did strike me, though, if you look at the anti-Semitic stereotypes in Der Stürmer, I mean, even the ritual murder accusation of what could be more medieval, kind of Christian, anti-Semitic belief and so forth than Jews murdered Christian children to squeeze out their blood for their Passover matzah. Well, Der Stürmer has a special issue on ritual murder. And just like the main anti-Semitic journal of Mussolini, La Difesa della Razza, is filled with Catholic images of saints and so forth, and previous church documents that denounce the Jews and so on. So I suspect that there's, obviously there are significant differences, not least, I mean, Italy is all Catholic, 2/3 of Germans are Protestants, which also puts, of course, the church institutionally, Catholic Church, in a different situation in Germany than it is in Italy. And one of the Pope's greatest fears, in fact, early on in Nazism, if you read some of the correspondence in 33, 34, is that Hitler is going to try to meld the Catholic Church and Protestant churches in one kind of nationalist Nazi church.
Hi. My question might be too naive, but what, in your opinion, are the factors that happened with Mussolini, going from his views of 1922, where you're saying he had no particular acts against the Jews, to the racial Nazi-like laws of 1938? What changed in Mussolini?
Yeah, this is a big debate among historians. There's, for example, a book that came out a few years ago called Mussolini Razzista, Mussolini the Racist, and tries to make the argument that he was always anti-Semitic, always racist, and so nothing really that much changed. I think most historians disagree with that. I would. Now, I think Mussolini shared some of the anti-Semitic stereotypes that were prevalent as he grew up. Of course, he grew up in this left-wing anarchist socialist milieu. He himself, as a youth, was a revolutionary socialist and denounced the Catholic Church and so forth, and priests. So, if we're kind of looking at his history, that's where he's coming from. Well, one theory or one account is that he basically wanted that Hitler said a kind of condition for our alliance. Remember, he was there just a couple months before the announcement in Rome. Hitler was in Rome before the racial policy was announced. That Hitler somehow told Mussolini, look, you've got to get aboard if you're going to be my ally. I think this didn't happen. What I do think happened is, part of what happened was that Mussolini wanted to please Hitler at this point and thought nothing might please him so much as to copy him in these anti-Semitic laws and announce a racial campaign. But I do think that he came to feel that there was a Jewish conspiracy against him. A number of the kind of leading anti-fascists, I mean, there weren't that many, and they were in exile, but at least a few of them were Jewish, and much was made of this, not least by Tacchi Venturi and Borgongini and others around the Pope in talking to Mussolini. And the experience of 35, 36, the isolation, the Ethiopian War, was, I think, another part of this. So I think there are multiple things. The single greatest factor, I think, was his trying to win Hitler's approval. But I do think his own views of the Jews had been undermined over the years before by a variety of factors, including the ones I tried to discuss today.